So the Basque people are a group of people that have been in the same part of the world for a very long time, thousands and thousands of years. What makes them kind of unique and gives them their own identity is their Basque language. It's called Euskara.
There's a population living in the mountains between Spain and France that modern genetics cannot fully explain. They call themselves Euskaldunak. The world calls them Basque. And for decades, scientists studying the deep roots of European ancestry kept bumping into the same problem. No matter which direction they approached from, linguistics, blood typing, archaeology, and eventually ancient DNA, the Basque people did not fit. They were not an outlier in the way that populations at the edges of continents sometimes are. They were an outlier in a category of their own. A signal in the data that kept pointing somewhere no one could find. The people who shouldn't exist. The first serious genetic flags came in the 1990s, when population geneticists began large-scale blood group surveys across Europe. The Basques showed the highest frequency of the Rh-negative blood type of any population on Earth, roughly 35% compared to a European average closer to 16%. Their O blood group frequency was also unusually elevated. These were not minor statistical wobbles. They were numbers that suggested the Basque gene pool had been sitting largely separate from surrounding European populations for a very long time. Long enough for frequencies to drift that far from their neighbors just across the Pyrenees and the Bay of Biscay. But blood typing only told part of the story. When researchers began mapping Y chromosome lineages, the genetic signature passed exclusively from father to son, the picture got stranger. The most common Y chromosome haplogroup among Basque men is R1b, specifically the subclade R1bs116/p312, which also dominates much of Western Europe. That part looked normal. What did not look normal was the pattern underneath it. The specific branches of R1b found at high frequency in the Basques showed a divergence pattern suggesting deep, localized ancestry. A population that had been in place and relatively isolated while the rest of Europe was being reshuffled around them. Then ancient DNA changed everything. Between 2015 and 2019, a series of landmark studies extracted and sequenced DNA from skeletal remains pulled out of caves and burial sites across the Iberian Peninsula, dating back as far as 7,000 years. The researchers were expecting to trace a clean line of ancestry forward into the modern Basque population. What they found instead was a sequence of near-total population replacements, ways of people who arrived, dominated, and were themselves eventually overwritten, with the Basques emerging at the end of it not as a continuous thread running back to the beginning, but as the last survivors of a world that was otherwise completely erased. The 2019 study published in Science by Olalde et al. Analyzed genome-wide data from 271 ancient Iberian individuals spanning 8,000 years of prehistory. The scale of what it revealed was not subtle. Wolfgang Hack, a molecular anthropologist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig and one of the lead researchers on several of these studies, described the pattern in terms that do not soften the implications. The people who were living in Iberia before these migrations were not absorbed. They were replaced. The genetic signal from the earlier populations drops in some regions to levels so low they are almost undetectable. Almost. Because in one small pocket of mountains straddling the French and Spanish border, that earlier signal held on, and the people carrying it today are still there, still speaking a language that connects to no other living tongue on Earth, still genetically distinct from the populations that replaced everyone around them. That is the thing that makes the Basque story disturbing in a way that a headline cannot capture. It is not just that they are unusual. It is that their existence is a record of catastrophes, repeated massive, and in some cases near total, that swept through prehistoric Europe and left almost nothing behind. The Basques are not just a people, they are an archive. And what that archive contains, when you read it carefully through the lens of ancient DNA, is a history of erasure so thorough that its scale is still being worked out. This is not a 90-day countdown. It is a story that took 9,000 years to reach the people standing in it today. The language no one can explain. Before the DNA studies, before the blood typing surveys, before any laboratory had ever extracted a molecule of genetic material from a prehistoric skeleton, there was already a signal hiding in plain sight. It was not buried in a cave or locked inside a chromosome. It was being spoken out loud every day by around 750,000 people living in a region the size of New Hampshire. The Basque language, Euskara, is what linguists call a language isolate. That term sounds technical and dry. What it actually means is that Euskara has no known relatives anywhere on Earth. No parent language, no sister languages, no cousins. Every other language spoken in Europe today, from Portuguese to Polish, from Greek to Gaelic, belongs to the Indo-European family. They share common grammatical structures, root words, and sound patterns that trace back to a single ancestral tongue spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Pull any two Indo-European languages apart, and with enough work you can find the shared skeleton underneath. The word for mother in Sanskrit is matar. In Latin, it is mater. In Old English, it is motor. The family resemblance is unmistakable once you know what you are looking for. Euskara has none of that. Its word for hand is esku. For water, it is ur. For stone, it is hari. For black, it is belts. None of these words connect to any other language family that has ever been identified, living or dead. Linguists have spent well over a century attempting to find a relative, connecting it to Caucasian languages, to extinct Iberian, to North African tongues, to hypothetical pre-Indo-European families that might have once stretched across the continent. Every serious attempt has failed. What makes this not just academically curious but genuinely strange is what Euskara's structure suggests about its age. The language has grammatical features so unusual that they have no parallel in the surrounding linguistic landscape. It is ergative absolutive in its alignment, meaning it handles the subjects of transitive and intransitive verbs in ways that are the inverse of how Indo-European languages work. Its verb forms are staggeringly complex, carrying information about the subject, the direct object, and the indirect object simultaneously inside a single conjugated form. A single Basque verb can contain what English would need an entire sentence to express. These are not the features of a young language that borrowed and adapted from neighbors. These are the hallmarks of a system that developed in relative isolation over an enormous span of time. Joseba Lacara, a linguist at the University of the Basque Country, and one of the leading authorities on Euskara's internal reconstruction, has spent decades working backward through the language's structure to estimate how long it must have been developing independently. His work on Proto-Basque reconstruction suggests the language has roots extending back at least 5,000 to 7,000 years in its current geographic territory, and quite possibly much further. That timeline is not a coincidence. It places the deep roots of Euskara in the same period that ancient DNA studies have now identified as the moment when the Basque genetic signal begins to diverge most sharply from the rest of Iberia. The language and the genome are pointing at the same thing from opposite directions. A population that was already in place before the Great Migrations began, that survived those migrations in ways no other Western European group managed, and that preserved in its vocabulary and grammar a record of a world that everywhere else was wiped clean. There is a word in Euskara that has attracted particular attention from researchers trying to connect language to deep prehistory. The word is aiskora, meaning axe. Its root, hates, means rock or stone. The word for axe, in other words, is built from the word for stone. This is exactly what you would expect from a language that was already fully formed before metal tools arrived in Iberia, a language that named its cutting tools after the material they were originally made from, and then kept that name even after bronze and iron replaced stone. In Indo-European languages, the words for axe typically derive from roots meaning to cut or to strike, reflecting a vocabulary that was updated or replaced during the Metal Ages. Euskara kept the older layer intact. This kind of linguistic fossil is not unique to aiskora. Researchers have identified a cluster of Basque words connected to agriculture, for hoe, for cereal cultivation, for domestic animals, that appear to be derived from roots meaning wild or natural versions of those same things. The word for domestic pig contains a root connected to the forest. The word for cultivated. Grain connects to a root associated with gathering. These are traces of a vocabulary in transition, a language that was present and already complex when farming arrived in Iberia around 7,500 years ago, and that absorbed the new reality of agriculture into an older linguistic framework rather than replacing it wholesale. That matters because it places Euskara, and by implication the ancestors of the Basques, in the Iberian Peninsula, before the Neolithic farming communities arrived from Anatolia, before the people who brought agriculture to Western Europe arrived. The language is a timestamp, and the timestamp predates the first great wave of replacement that ancient DNA would later expose in the bones. Anthony teaches historical linguistics at Oxford and has written extensively on the relationship between language spread and prehistoric migration. His position on Euskara is shared by most specialists in the field. A language this isolated, with this much internal complexity, does not appear from nowhere. It is the product of a long, slow development in a relatively contained geographic space, and the Pyrenean region, which created a natural barrier between the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of Europe, is exactly the kind of place where such isolation could have been maintained across millennia, even as the populations on both sides of the mountains were being transformed. The DNA and linguistics are now converging on the same conclusion. The Basques are not an anomaly created by recent history. They are a remnant. The language they speak is older than the nations surrounding them, older than the ethnic identities of their neighbors, older in its deep structure than the arrival of farming in Western Europe. It is a living record of a prehistoric population that should, by all the rules that applied everywhere else in Europe, no longer exist. The question is what happened to everyone else, and the answer to that starts not in the Pyrenees, but in a village in central Anatolia, roughly 9,000 years ago, when a group of people figured out how to grow their own food and then started walking. The farmers who rewrote Europe. There is a moment in European prehistory that most history books skip entirely. Not because it is unimportant, because for most of the 20th century nobody knew it happened. The tools were not sophisticated enough. The bones were there, sitting in museum drawers and cave sediment across the continent, but they could not yet speak. When ancient DNA finally gave them a voice, what they said rewrote the entire story of how modern Europeans came to be and put the Basque survival into a context that makes it almost incomprehensible. For most of human prehistory, Europe was inhabited by hunter-gatherers. They had been there for tens of thousands of years, surviving ice ages, adapting to tundra and forest, developing cultures of extraordinary sophistication. The people who painted the caves at Lascaux in southern France around 17,000 years ago were not primitive. They were anatomically modern humans, with complex social structures, long-distance trade networks, and artistic traditions that rival anything produced in the ancient world. They hunted mammoth and reindeer. fished the rivers, and moved seasonally across landscapes they understood intimately. Europe was theirs. And then, around 9,000 years ago, something began moving toward them from the east that would change everything. The wave that came from Anatolia. The Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, did not develop independently in Europe. It was imported. The people who brought it were migrants from Anatolia, the region that today forms the bulk of modern Turkey, who had been developing agricultural techniques for millennia in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East. Around 7000 BCE, these Anatolian farmers began moving westward into Europe, following river valleys and coastlines, carrying with them domesticated wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, and pigs. The speed of this expansion was remarkable. Within roughly 3,000 years, farming communities had spread from the Aegean coast all the way to the Atlantic shores of Portugal and the plains of northern Europe. Archaeological sites across the continent show the same pattern. The sudden appearance of pottery, polished stone tools, domesticated animal bones, and the skeletal remains of people who looked genetically nothing like the hunter-gatherers who had been living there before them. The 2015 study published in Nature, one of the most consequential ancient DNA papers ever published, sequenced genome-wide data from 69 ancient Europeans spanning 8,000 years. The results were unambiguous. The Anatolian farmers who spread across Europe were not just culturally distinct from the hunter-gatherers they encountered. They were a genetically separate population, and they brought with them an ancestry profile that was almost absent from pre-Neolithic Europe. What happened when these two populations met is where the story turns disturbing. In region after region, the genomic signal from the indigenous European hunter-gatherers does not gradually blend with the incoming farmer ancestry. It collapses. In some areas, within just a few centuries of the farmer's arrival, the hunter-gatherer genetic signal drops from dominant to nearly undetectable. The Anatolian farmer ancestry takes over so completely that the people who had inhabited those landscapes for tens of thousands of years essentially vanish from the gene pool. Johannes Krauss, director of the Department of Archaeogenetics at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, has described this pattern across multiple studies. The Neolithic transition in Europe was not primarily a cultural transfer. It was a demographic replacement. The farmers did not teach the hunter-gatherers to farm. They replaced them. The mechanism behind this replacement is still debated. There is no evidence in the archaeological record of organized, large-scale warfare in the early Neolithic transition across most of Western Europe. What the evidence does suggest is a combination of factors that together made the outcome nearly inevitable. Farming communities can support far higher population densities than hunter-gatherer bands. A single farming village operating on a few hundred acres of cultivated land can sustain 10 to 20 times the number of people that the same area of forest could feed through hunting and gathering. When the Anatolian farmers arrived with their crops and their animals and their ability to produce surplus food, they brought with them a demographic engine that the existing hunter-gatherer populations simply could not match. More people, faster reproduction, denser settlements, the math worked against the hunter-gatherers, even without a single act of deliberate violence. Disease almost certainly played a role. The Anatolian farmers had been living in close proximity to domesticated animals for thousands of years and had developed partial immunities to a range of zoonotic diseases that would have been catastrophic for populations encountering them for the first time. The parallel with what happened to indigenous populations in the Americas after 1492 is imperfect but instructive. When populations with no shared disease history make contact, the consequences for the group without immunity are rarely survivable at scale. What the bones showed in Iberia. In Iberia specifically, the picture is among the most dramatic on the continent. Leolalde et al. 2019 study examined ancient DNA from individuals spanning the entire span of Iberian prehistory, from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers through the Bronze Age. What it found in the Neolithic transition layer was stark. Before the farmers arrived, the Iberian Peninsula was populated by Western hunter-gatherers with a distinctive genetic profile, high proportions of a lineage researchers label WHG, characterized by specific variants connected to dark skin, blue eyes, and lactose intolerance, among other traits. These were the descendants of the people who had survived the last glacial maximum in Iberian refugia and repopulated parts of Europe as the ice retreated. After the Anatolian farmers arrived in Iberia around 5,500 BCE, the WHG ancestry in the region drops dramatically within a geologically short period. In the farming communities that replaced them, WHG ancestry accounts for only around 10 to 25% of the total genome. The rest is overwhelmingly Anatolian Neolithic in origin. In some inland regions, the replacement appears even more complete. There is, however, one notable exception to this pattern in Iberia. In samples from the northern region associated with the Basque geographic area, the WHG ancestry component is preserved at higher levels than almost anywhere else in the Western Peninsula. Not dominant, the Anatolian farming ancestry still arrived and made its mark, but present in proportions that stand out against the surrounding data like a thumbprint on clean glass. Even 7,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Basques were already holding on to something that everyone else was losing: the world the farmers built. The Neolithic transition did not just replace a population. It replaced an entire way of being human in Europe. The hunter-gatherers who were displaced or absorbed had lived in small mobile bands with broadly egalitarian social structures. Skeletal evidence from pre-Neolithic European sites shows relatively low rates of interpersonal violence and nutritional stress. These were not easy lives by modern standards, but they were not lives defined by hierarchy, chronic hunger, or mass conflict either. The farming communities that replaced them brought something more productive and something considerably darker. Agricultural surplus creates the conditions for social stratification. When some people can accumulate more food than others, hierarchies form. The archaeological record from Neolithic farming communities across Europe shows a rapid increase in markers of inequality: large central structures that appear to be elite residences, burial sites where some individuals are interred with significant grave goods and others are not, and skeletal evidence of increasing nutritional inequality within the same settlements. The work of Ron Pinhazi, a bioarchaeologist at the University of Vienna, who has studied skeletal health across the Neolithic transition at sites across Europe, shows a consistent pattern. The shift to farming was associated with a measurable decline in average health outcomes: shorter stature, higher rates of dental decay, greater evidence of infectious disease, and more markers of childhood nutritional stress. The Anatolian farmers who replaced the hunter-gatherers were not living better lives in terms of individual biological health. They were living in larger numbers, in denser settlements, with more social complexity and more disease, and that combination gave them a demographic power that the healthier but sparser hunter-gatherer populations could not resist. This is the first layer of the disturbing picture. A continent-wide population, present for tens of thousands of years, reduced to near invisibility in the genetic record within a few millennia. The people who painted Lascaux, who hunted mammoth across the tundra, who built the first symbolic cultures in Europe, their descendants are almost gone from the modern European genome. The Anatolian farmers did not just arrive, they overwrote what was there. And the Anatolian farmers themselves were not finished being overwritten, because roughly 5,000 years ago something appeared on the eastern horizon of Europe that would do to the Anatolian farmer populations almost exactly what those populations had done to the hunter-gatherers before them. It came from the steppe. It moved fast, and when the ancient DNA researchers found its signal in the bones, what they measured was not a migration. It was a near erasure. The steppe, the survivors, and what the genome left behind. Around 5,000 years ago, a second wave hit Europe. This one came not from the south but from the east, from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grassland stretching across what is now Ukraine and Russia. The people carrying it are called the Yamnaya. They had domesticated the horse, invented wheeled transport, and developed a pastoral economy that let them move fast and far across open ground. They also carried something invisible and lethal to the populations ahead of them, a set of genetic advantages honed by millennia of steppe survival, and almost certainly diseases to which the farming communities of Europe had no immunity. The Yamnaya expansion into Europe was not gradual. It was, by the standards of prehistoric demographic change, explosive. The 2015 Hack et al. Study that documented the Anatolian farmer replacement also found a second, equally dramatic signal layered on top of it. Within roughly 500 years of the Yamnaya's arrival in northern and central Europe, steppe ancestry accounts for up to 75% of the total genome in affected populations. The Anatolian farmers who had themselves replaced the hunter-gatherers were now being replaced in turn. The most disturbing detail in this second replacement is what happened specifically to the men. A 2019 study by Olalde et al. And parallel work by David Reich's lab at Harvard found that in the transition period associated with the Yamnaya expansion into Iberia, the Y chromosome signal, the paternal lineage passed from father to son, from the existing farming population dropped by as much as 90% within just a few centuries. The maternal lineages, carried in mitochondrial DNA, showed a much less severe disruption. What that asymmetry means in plain terms is that the men of the farming communities were being removed from the reproductive pool at a rate that has no obvious, peaceful explanation. Women survived in larger numbers. Men did not. Whether this reflects organized violence, the systematic killing or displacement of men from conquered populations, or some combination of disease and social collapse that disproportionately killed males, the genetic signal does not say. What it does say is that the pattern is real. It is consistent across multiple sites and studies, and it represents one of the most dramatic demographic events in European prehistory. An entire generation of men, across a vast geographic area, was essentially erased from the paternal line in a window so short it barely registers in the geological record. Across almost all of Western Europe, this steppe signal overwhelmed what came before it. In Britain, steppe ancestry replaced approximately 90% of the existing Neolithic farmer genome within a few centuries after 2500 BCE. In Central Europe, the numbers are similar. In Iberia, the replacement was somewhat less complete but still dominant in most regions. The Indo-European languages that the Yamnaya carried with them spread with their genes, replacing whatever languages the farming communities had spoken, which is exactly why every major European language today is Indo-European, descended from that steppe tongue. Except one. The Basque region, sitting in its mountain pocket on the Atlantic edge of the Pyrenees, absorbed steppe ancestry but never let it dominate. Modern Basque genomes carry roughly 60 to 65% Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, and around 10 to 15% Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, with steppe contributions lower than in virtually any other Western European population. The mountains filtered the wave. The isolation that had already preserved the WHG signal through the first replacement now preserved the farmer signal through the second. The Basques survived not one continent-wide erasure but two, and came out the other side as the closest living genetic representatives of the Neolithic farmers who first brought agriculture to Western Europe. They are, in the most literal sense, a living archive of a world that was otherwise completely overwritten. Their language is the last voice of a pre-Indo-European Europe. Their genome carries the highest surviving proportions of an ancestry that everywhere else was reduced to a faint background signal. Jacob's well is going dry. The last ramp is still in the water. David Reich, whose lab at Harvard has produced some of the most consequential ancient DNA research of the past decade, framed the broader implication in terms that do not leave much room for comfort. The story of prehistoric Europe is not a story of people mixing and cultures blending. It is a story of repeated, near-total replacements, events so thorough that the populations who came before are visible today only as trace signals in the genomes of their conquerors' descendants. The Basques are the exception that defines the rule. They exist because geography gave them a shield that no one else had. Take away the Pyrenees, and there is no Euskara, no R-negative anomaly, no living genetic record of what Europe looked like before the steppe arrived. The disturbing part is not that this happened. Populations have always moved, displaced, and replaced one another throughout human history. The disturbing part is the scale and the completeness, and what the Basque survival forces us to reckon with. If one mountain range was enough to preserve a people through 2 continent-wide replacements, then what was lost everywhere the mountains were not high enough. How many languages vanished without leaving a single word behind? How many genetic lineages were compressed into invisibility, leaving no Basque-like remnant to mark that they were ever there? The Basques did not survive because they were stronger or more advanced. They survived because of where they were standing, and in that randomness is something that sits uncomfortably between luck and tragedy. Canyon Lake is 22 feet below where it is supposed to be. Europe is carrying a genome that is 90% different from what it held 5,000 years ago. Both numbers are hard to fit into a headline. Both point at the same truth. The world we think is permanent is almost always a recent replacement of something older, and the only reason we know what was lost is because, in one small corner of the map, it somehow survived. If this made you think, hit like, it helps more than you know. Subscribe if you want the full picture every week, and drop a comment. What people, what mystery, what place should we cover next?